Hey everyone, John P. here. Today I'm going to be talking about how the popular musician Adam Levine was potentially or maybe even likely scammed with his Rolex watches. That's right, this popular musician was recently on an episode of Talking Watches with Hodinkee, which I actually quite enjoy. Now, I will say that in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you all of the scenarios in which this could have happened, right? There are many people online, thanks to great blogs like Periscope on Instagram. They kind of point out inconsistencies with different watches that they find online. And there are other sources where there's a lot of chatter really going on about a particular Rolex Newman Daytona that was featured by this musician on the Talking Watches episode, and how there are some replacement parts. And I'm gonna kind of share with you from my experience dealing with so many watches at Delray Watch and out through the years of all the scenarios on how this could have happened. Many people want to focus and say, oh, this was clearly a fraud, this was clearly a scam, but it doesn't necessarily mean so. I'm gonna share with you all the ways this could have happened based on what I've seen all the time being in the watch industry. And of course, disclaimer, this is going to include a lot of speculation. This is in no way any kind of a hit piece or anything like that. More so, share with you some brief info about what people are saying and my take on what could have happened. So none of this is definitive or an attack or anything like that. And I always want to give the benefit of the doubt and where there is some, as well as plausible deniability. So who's Adam Levine? Adam Levine is a musician in a group called Maroon 5. In my opinion, they're pretty good. They've got some hits out there, kind of like mom music or music that, maybe you'd hear overhead at like a Target or something, kind of like wide mass appeal type music. So they're notable, right? They're a big group. And of course, with big group comes big spending a lot of the times. And that's what we have here on the Talking Watches episode. There'll be a link in the description below where you can watch the video for yourself. But he has some pretty nice watches, right? He has a Newman Daytona. He's got a gold variant as well of a 6263. He's got a rainbow Daytona. He's got a Patek Philippe. He's got some others. Watch the video. It's pretty cool nonetheless. But there's one particular watch of a vintage Rolex Daytona Newman where the likes of Periscope, who sometimes calls out celebrities for certain watches when they're clearly against what he believes to be authentic. And that takes us into what's being debated here, but pretty much there is consensus in the online community by people that do this every day that the bezel is not original on the particular watch, as well as the pushers. The pushers stand out much more than the bezel. And there is some there's some debate on the dial, it being a little bit too pristine. Now, interjecting a little bit here, I will say when it comes to these watches, these particular watches that are now ultra desirable were not desirable when they were created. In some cases, they just weren't focused on at all. I mean, people would rather have had the gold, date or Datejust back then. That was more in style than these chronographs, which didn't serve too much of a purpose in your everyday life. So it's like, hey, why would you get it back then? Collectors didn't exist like they do now. And with that came lower quality of materials on some of these watches made for sporting. So today, yes, it's much easier for them to reproduce parts because it doesn't take a lot of advanced machinery to do so. But that kind of, on the flip side, allows maybe the parts to be too high quality, which is what we have here with people saying the dial is potentially too high quality, as well as how precise and too sharp of the font on the bezel. I'll put a link for their Instagram post for the people calling them out as well. And so, we have this idea here. This guy has this watch that people say is inauthentic. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to share with you all the ways this could happen. I see it every day. And especially working with this type of client, they're not always in the same type of mindset as us on the internet that are sometimes geeking out about this stuff. So I think that's very important to take into consideration. Now, it is also kind of interesting, while doing a little bit of research for this, just 6 months ago, actually, this particular person did end up making public comments and dragging into a bit of a legal situation a vintage Maserati car that they claim is inauthentic as well. So there seems to be a bit of a history here of this person, potentially getting into enthusiast areas of the market and maybe, not working with someone that they really know or trust, or maybe they weren't aware of that. Once again, speculation, but I do need to drive home the point. Always, when it comes to watches, especially rare watches, vintage watches, make sure you work with people that you trust. Do checks on them, talk with other people, and also Google around, make sure there's nothing, kind of off about their background. So this is the watch in question, and there's going to be a couple of different ways this could have played out. First, it's possible that when they bought this watch, the dealer disclosed these potentially aftermarket or replacement pushers, bezel, as well as the dial. It's very possible that it was disclosed. We don't know where this watch was purchased. It's very possible, you walk into a store and the dealer's like, just so you know, these are aftermarket parts, it still looks great, blah, blah, blah. And they just didn't care. Maybe it didn't mean anything to them at the time, or maybe they got a great deal. That is, of course, up to them at the end of the day. Or maybe they just didn't realize that this was maybe a frowned down upon thing, right? Just like the people that will take a watch and bust it down, as they call it, put some, aftermarket diamonds and things on that. People like that. They do it, and they like to modify watches sometimes. You see it out there. People come out with custom watches, and he's not an exception. He just released or he did a watch, a special piece with Artisans de Genève, making a custom Daytona. So he doesn't appear that he's against modifying or having aftermarket parts in any kind of a way, just by his actions alone. So that's the first scenario is, hey, the dealer said, yeah, just so you know, these parts are aftermarket. The choice is yours. You can make the choice. And, maybe Hodinkee knew, maybe they didn't. Maybe they didn't have a loop with them. Maybe they knew where the watch came from. That's another scenario. Sometimes when things slip through the cracks, it's because someone doesn't check and they just say, oh, well, that dealer touched it, so they must have looked. And sometimes that kind of adds up, and it's like the old game of telephone. Nonetheless, that takes us into the next scenario. Is it's possible that this watch he took for service somewhere, right? He dropped it off somewhere, maybe for evaluation, or he took it to a jewelry store, or maybe he even had one of his assistants do it, right? Sometimes at this level of the game, and you see this at all the antique shows, you see this in the art world, when you get into watches of this level, it's more art, and there's oftentimes buyers for this, right? The guy that buys your rare, antique furniture might be the same guy, believe it or not, for some people at this range that's buying your watches for you. They go to the Miami Beach Antique Show and, they chat a little bit, they kind of feel out the dealer and they buy it on a wire, they send the funds, and that's that. And that's what happens. You wouldn't believe the stories I've heard about certain people at this level that buy it because they just wanted it, and then it sits at the auction house and it just waits for them to pick it up, and they never pick it up, and the auction house has to beg them to come pick up their watch. It's just, they have better things to do. So hey, maybe he took it in for service somewhere. Once again, the watchmaker swapped out the parts with these aftermarket because he knew he could take those parts and build a watch elsewhere, or he could sell those parts on the market and get a ton of money and maybe pull one over on someone. Once again, speculation, but I've heard this, and I haven't seen this, but I've heard this from people that fell into this situation where, hey, maybe that happens. And it becomes difficult because, unless you had pictures of that watch there under a loop before you dropped it off, and after, it becomes a lot of pointing fingers, and you have some guy that runs a repair shop, and maybe it wasn't, a great shop that you dropped it off to begin with. It becomes really gray. And then what are they going to do? Drag it into court? No, it's mostly, I think, at that point about kind of tainting reputation and maybe getting a few dollars or taking the watch back if possible. Could have happened. I've heard of this. Now, this takes us into kind of the last scenario here where it wasn't disclosed to the buyer, whether it was an assistant or, Adam himself. Maybe it wasn't disclosed. That's possible, and it could be either that the dealer that sold it didn't know. We're talking about the minutiae here of the watches, and not all dealers will either put in the time to make sure everything is good. Oftentimes they just kind of take word on it, believe it or not. I've seen this all the time. It's just a thing, especially dealers that have been doing this for 40 years. It's, they maybe haven't quite caught on to kind of the gravity or the seriousness that people take some of these things today, because back then, oh, you could just buy a Rolex watch 40 years ago and they'd swap a dial for you at the AD, or they'd swap a bracelet. That was something. So maybe they haven't kind of caught on to this new way that watches are being looked at. I still see old school dealers polish up all their watches, and us at Delray Watch, we're like, you're polishing all your watches? Are you insane? Nobody wants that. Half of the emails we receive, people say, is this watch polished? They don't want it polished. They'd rather have it oftentimes with the dents, scratches, and dings, knowing that it's authentic. Polish can be a red flag. So hey, maybe they didn't know. That could be an error on their part. It's kind of negligent in a way, right? And that also takes us, and crazy story, this sometimes happens, right? I mean, a customer said they purchased a really great watch at a dealer, a small dealer, but a dealer that didn't have a watchmaker, and it was a Rolex watch. We bring it in, we had our watchmaker open it up. There was a Seiko movement on the inside, and inside the case back, it was scratched, custom watch or something like that. Like someone slapped it together. So hey, that's kind of a different scenario, but people get crazier with it sometimes. Once again, trust the dealer. But that takes us into the dealer just didn't care, right? Sometimes that's out there. When you walk into, maybe a smaller store that preys, I say prey, but that's kind of negative, right? Maybe they just focus on people that aren't collectors, right? Someone that just wants a shiny watch or something like that. You see this on Worth Avenue in Palm Beach. You get these guys that just have this big smile and they've got all this kind of a thing, and you walk in and they kind of stroke your ego and like, oh, please, this and that and this and the other. It's kind of like those guys at the mall that try to, sell you these creams. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, you look so good, Mrs. Jones, or whatever. Like, take this cream. Your skin is going to look even better. They kind of like, prey on you in that kind of a way. In my opinion, these people exist, and hey, maybe they just saw a quick deal and they moved on. They didn't care. Hey, if he's got an issue with it, it'll come back. They never imagined that it would be, like on the watch collector equivalent of Good Morning America kind of a deal where, now you have thousands of collectors out there with their reference books and zooming in and looking at the pictures and looking at the metadata on all this stuff. Like this is maybe something that the dealers just didn't catch on to. We know this at Delray Watch because we live in that community, but not everyone does. So they said, hey, we don't care, old school mentality, move it along. So guys, this is what could have happened here. I mean, I find it really hard to believe that there would be, ill intent here if it was from a reliable dealer. Everyone that I know does their diligence, tries to do as best of a job as possible, and they will even go down to the nitty-gritty of comparing known good examples that were in the back of a safe somewhere, just to verify everything is the same, because that's something to keep in mind here. Is Rolex is not coming out and saying this. They don't do that. It's very rare for people to want to get in the middle of these situations when there are franken claims or inauthentic claims, especially the brands. And back then, things were kind of gray, so not all the brands have every single thing cataloged. There's been times in the past where Rolex has denied things have existed, and then they were, and then people get in this back and forth. You've got the blueberry bezels for the GMT Master, and so many other countless things where just the brands don't want to get in the middle, the media sources don't want to get in the middle, right? There's plenty of people kind of like giving all this negative press to Hodinkee, like they should have known. Why are they not getting in the middle? Why are they not taking the video down? When they get in the middle, then they're defending or they are opposing a watch that is not theirs. This is a scenario between the seller and the buyer, and maybe even the brand. When other voices get involved, now they're part of the argument. Now they're going to be called to say, hey, why did you say this? And then if for some reason they're wrong, now they're starting to defend their point. And for what? So I can say that that is very likely why, Hodinkee is not getting involved in this. And it happens, right? So, and something else to keep in mind is when we talk about these high-end vintage watches, today I just talked in my last video, these watches are more art pieces. They're art pieces, they go to the auction houses, and that is where they're kind of trading in that kind of collector community where they're collecting it for not necessarily what it is, but the importance of it or the perceived importance of it. You see it in the art world with pieces of art, and it's starting to come out today that different art authentication services that use advanced techniques and AI and image detection are determining maybe upwards of 50 to 70% of art that is traded is actually not truly authentic. Many art pieces that sell for millions and millions and millions and get put on these mega yachts by these guys that honestly had a buyer buy it. Maybe they saw a picture of it once on the boat they never even sat on. It's coming out that, maybe 80, 90% of the painting was repainted. They say restoration, but they're repainting it with recreated paint to kind of match the chemical composition so it passes the primitive checks, but not these more advanced checks. So we're seeing that start to come out here with watches. And I think to sum this all up, it goes once again to say, try to find someone that you can trust, do your research. There are people out there in the world that maybe only have their best interest in mind. They take risks, they don't care. So you have to do your own research when you get into these collector communities, whether it's cars, watches, paintings, anything of value. You should trust but verify. Do the research, have some faith, and work with the people that have your back. So guys, I'd love to hear and see in the comments your thoughts and opinions. Please leave them down below, and we'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P.